students, faculty, members of the Ohio State University community, and guests, welcome. I am impressed. I understand there's a baseball game of some consequence tonight.
We've still got an hour before.
That's right. And there is a race for the presidency and a few other issues, I'm sure, that demand attention, and I am impressed with the attendance tonight for this debate. The question before us is, should government in a free society limit gun ownership? My name is Jim Lott, and I will serve as the moderator this evening. And I've done a little moderating over the years. Back in the American Bicentennial, I moderated debates on National Public Radio, and later, some of you may remember Cube. Those of you with white hair will remember that. 25 years ago, we did debates where you could push a button at home and vote yes or no, and we had a bunch of those, and I got to moderate those, and then a few, including candidates for governor on public television. But this is refreshing. We have gathered here tonight to have a serious discussion of an important issue, and I hope they have more chairs because I'm noticing a lot of people standing. So there are some seats, I know, interspersed that you may take. Tonight's debate inaugurates a collegiate debate series that will travel the country under the title Cicero's Podium, a great issues debate series. And I knew that my education in the classics would come handy at some point, so Cicero is one person I did study while I was in school. Each formal debate aims to elevate and exemplify civil discussion, promote genuine intellectual diversity, and encourage and inspire college students and the general public to become actively engaged with the books and ideas that have shaped the American experiment in ordered liberty. Tonight's debate is sponsored by the generous support of the Arthur N. Roop Foundation, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and the Ohio State Debate Team at the John Glenn Institute. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our debaters. Speaking for the affirmative, that is, on the question, should government in a free society limit gun ownership, answering yes to that question, is Jim Kessler. Jim is Policy and Research Director of Americans for Gun Safety, where he is responsible for developing new legislative and policy ideas, as well as generating reports to further a politically moderate set of positions on guns. Before joining Americans for Gun Safety, Kessler worked for 12 years on Capitol Hill, including 8 years as Representative, then Senator, Charles Schumer's top legislative aide. As Schumer's top policy aide, he worked toward passage of the Brady Law and the assault weapons ban. Kessler has worked on numerous political campaigns and was instrumental in Schumer's successful race for the Senate. He also writes a political column for UPI.com. Kessler has a master's degree in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government and Bachelor of Arts degree from Boston University. Opposing limitations on gun ownership, and thus speaking for the negative, is John Lott. John researches crime, antitrust, education, gun control, campaign finance, and voting and legislative behavior as a research scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Lott has been a senior research fellow at Yale Law School, visiting professor at the University of Chicago, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Rice University, UCLA, and Texas A&M. He is the author of More Guns, Less Crime, Understanding Crime and Gun Control Laws, and The Bias Against Guns, Why Almost Everything You've Heard About Gun Control is Wrong. Lott was the beneficiary of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's Weaver Fellowship and earned his master's and doctorate at UCLA. The debate will be formal and will follow a modified intercollegiate debate format, which allows each debater to make an opening argument, a rebuttal, and then a series of rebuttals within fixed time periods. The structure also allows for audience questions at the end of the formal debate period. So take notes, write your questions down. We'll have a 20-minute period following the argument. The debate will be conducted in accordance with a 90-minute schedule. Opening affirmative statement from the affirmative first, 20 minutes, and then an opening negative statement of 20 minutes, and then a 5-minute rebuttal from the affirmative, followed by a 5-minute negative rebuttal, and then a second affirmative rebuttal of 5 minutes, a second negative rebuttal of 5 minutes, and then 2 closing sets of arguments, 5 minutes for the affirmative and 5 minutes for the negative. If any of you have ever read the Lincoln and Douglas debates, very similar formats were utilized in those. Then there will be 20 minutes, during which time you may ask questions. We're going to ask you not to make statements or to give speeches, but to ask questions, and we will allow each of the advocates an opportunity to respond. So now the question: should government in a free society limit gun ownership? Mr. Kessler.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim, for moderating this. I want to thank the John Glenn Institute for hosting this event and the Arthur Roop Foundation, as well as ISI for bringing us here. The Ohio State debate team that's also a sponsor. I also want to thank John Lott, who is, I've faced off with him before, and I would say he's certainly a worthy adversary. He's the intellectual backbone of the gun rights movement and just a tremendous scholar on this issue. And I want to thank the audience as well. I mean, this is just a tremendous crowd to come out tonight on a beautiful night where, of course, there is a baseball game, but it's very, very impressive. And for me, I'm also glad to be here in a swing state. I've been in Washington, D.C. Lived there for the last 15 years, and certainly all during the campaign season. So I imagine you must be bleary-eyed with ads, and there's only 8 days to go, inclusive. So thank you very much for inviting us, and I hope we can live up in some way to what Cicero had in mind. I'm going to begin by, since it is the campaign season, and since there's all sorts of polls, I'm going to just begin by asking the audience members to raise their hands to a series of questions. If the answer is yes, we'll do our own little poll. The first question is, how many people here are gun owners, or if you're a student, grew up with a gun in the home? Okay, that's, I would say, about 80%. How many grew up in a home with a handgun? Slightly less, maybe 50 or 60%. How many people here have been a victim of a gun crime? I'll put my hand up on that one as well. And how many here have ever used a gun to stop a crime? Large number of that as well. Let me give you some national statistics, which you may know, you may not know, but I think in this issue, I think especially in American discourse, American political discourse, there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of heated discussion on the gun issue. I think there's been more heat than light on the issue, and this, since it is, I believe, such an important topic for all sorts of reasons in America, maybe some of these numbers will enlighten you. In America, 47%, roughly 47% of households have a gun in the home. So this audience is a bit of an anomaly that there's a higher gun ownership rate. The gun ownership rate in Ohio pretty much mirrors the gun ownership rate nationwide. About half of the people, half the households in Ohio have a gun in the home. There are between 200 and 250 million guns in private hands in America, based on surveys. About 2/3 of those are long guns, about 1/3 are handguns. In a typical year, somewhere between 7 and 8 million firearms are bought from licensed gun stores in America, closer to 8 million than 7 million. In a typical recent year, the crime rate generally has gone down. There are 9,000 gun homicides each year, and there are also approximately 300,000 gun crimes in America in a typical year. 90% of the guns that are used in crime, the person who used the gun in a crime is not the person who originally bought the gun. So there is some sort of exchange that is getting the gun into the hand of a criminal. In 1/3 of all crime gun traces, and pretty good, and since there are over 100,000 crime gun traces, a pretty good indication of all gun crimes. In 1/3 of those cases, the gun is less than 3 years old. In 1/3 of those cases, the gun was used in a crime in a state other than where the gun was originally bought. So if you put those factors together, 90% of guns used in crime, the person using it is not the person who bought it. 1/3 of the guns are basically new, and this is by the time they're less than 3 years old, and this is by the time the police are actually in possession of the gun. And 1/3 of the guns cross state lines. It's an indication that there are massive gun trafficking operations in America that are somehow taking guns from legal commerce, the 8 million people who are buying guns through licensed gun stores, most of whom I assume are buying them for legal purposes, but there is definitely indications when you look at crime gun traces of a vast illegal market, a black market, which is taking guns from the legal market to the illegal market. 90% of all gun crimes were committed with handguns. That makes sense. It's hard to carry a concealed shotgun on the street. The guns, when a long gun is used in a crime, they tend to be used more in crimes of domestic violence than in street crimes. There are approximately 100,000 licensed gun stores in America. To sell guns in America as a business, you have to be federally licensed. So there are approximately 100,000 stores. There are more gun stores in America than there are McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King's combined. Last year, the Department of Justice prosecuted only 32 gun stores for wrongdoing. It must be the cleanest industry in America, but that was an improvement over the year before when they prosecuted 27 gun stores. I'll get into this more a little bit later, but basically what it shows is since no industry could possibly be that clean, and certainly the gun industry is no more clean than any other industry, there is really no enforcement of federal gun laws in America, and there are plenty of federal gun laws. They're just not enforced. About 150,000 firearms are stolen out of people's homes and cars every year. And other than prescription drugs, guns are the only item that sell for a higher price than the retail price on the street than what they do in the store. And what that is an indication of is that a gun that is basically untraceable, or a gun that makes its way into the black market, is a valuable commodity. You'll hear people say, well, criminals will always be able to find a way to get guns, and to a certain extent it's true, but it's expensive. It's an expensive proposition to obtain an illegal gun if you're a gang member or a street thug or just in the business of crime. So I just wanted to start out with some basic statistics. I know John Lott will have some statistics as well, but I think they're different than the ones that you typically hear, and the ones that I think can polarize the gun issue even more, or make the gun issue seem more alarmist. Of the 30,000 gun deaths in America every year, 60% of them to 65% are suicides. So if you want to look at, the quote, the gun problem in America, in terms of at least gun deaths, suicide would be number one. But obviously, I don't think, and I think most people would agree, suicide is not a gun problem. It is some other type of problem in America. Gun accidents, if you look at the gun control groups on the left, they really talk about gun accidents like it's a huge, huge problem. Anytime a child is killed accidentally, by any way, it's a tragedy. But in 2001, which is the most recent year I've seen statistics, there were 158 kids under the age of 16, I believe, that were killed accidentally. I might be a little bit wrong, but something in that. Somewhere in that vicinity. About 100, I think it was 158 kids under the age of 16 were killed accidentally with a firearm. It is not the huge problem that you hear on the left. For years in Washington, and I think in political debates all across the country, the gun issue has been debated as a black and white issue, and I think it's a mistake. I think it's sad, and I think it's wrong, and I also feel that it has made America less safe. You have on one side groups like the NRA and others to the right of the NRA that basically feel that gun rights are absolute, that really there's no place for gun restrictions under the Second Amendment. You have on the other side groups that think that the Constitution doesn't allow for an individual right to own a gun at all, that it is some sort of collective right. So therefore, any gun law is allowed. And for years, you've just had these two sides fighting back and forth. And to be honest with you, I worked on Capitol Hill for many, many years. Politicians aren't going to spend that much time thinking about the gun issue. They're going to think about, they have 50, 100 different issues that they're thinking about. And they're going to get their cues from these different organizations. If that's the way the gun issue has been described for years and years and years, that's the way they're going to look at it. And that's the way it has been described. So you've got people basically saying that guns are the scourge of America and they need to be eliminated, and let's at the very least get rid of handguns. And you have folks on the other side who think that, look, the problem in America isn't too few guns, or too many guns. The problem in America is too few guns, and that only more guns make for a polite society, a safer community, a better community. And the fact of the matter is, and our organization pioneered this, there is a middle ground on this issue that I think could help make America more safe. And that is that there is a Second Amendment constitutional right to own guns. If there isn't an individual right to own guns, I don't think it would be in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is about individual rights, not collective rights. But just like any right, it allows for restrictions. So when the question is, and let me just read it, should government in a free society limit gun ownership? I believe the answer is yes. But I also believe before we limit gun ownership and to say, like, well, we need to do this, we need to ban handguns, or people should be able to buy a gun to hunt, or for whatever reason, we have to define what is truly the gun problem in America and try and solve it. It is a public policy problem. when 9,000 people are being killed in gun crimes each year, when there are 300,000 violent gun crimes each year, it's clear that in America there's a crime problem that also intersects with a gun problem. And, you know, our gun problem, the way it intersects with crime, is different than other countries. It's different than Canada, it's different than Sweden, it's different than Japan, it's different than England, it's different than France. It is somewhat unique based on what America is. America is a country that values strongly its freedoms, but it is also a very diverse and complicated place. So what our group has tried to do at Americans for Gun Safety, and what I believe is the key to this issue, is really trying to define what is the problem there and what public policy solutions allow us to protect people's individual gun rights as much as possible within the bounds of the Constitution, and restrict gun ownership in such a way that we are protecting people from gun crime and from a society that of mayhem, which it is in certain areas of this country. And the problem, the gun problem, such as it is in America, is a black market problem. It is a problem in which guns are going from legal commerce to illegal commerce. And every law that we pass on guns should be designed to thwart that black market. It is not we're not trying to use a cliche. It's not rocket science. There are predictable routes in which guns go from gun store to straw buyer, that is someone who's buying a gun that is definitely not for their own use, into a gun trafficking ring and to street criminals. And the key to doing this is basically to require, and it's not very difficult, is to essentially require background checks for the purchase of firearms in any commercial enterprise. That if you look at, that would be the major restriction to do. And the second thing that needs to be done is that we need to actually enforce the gun laws on the books. You know, you hear from politicians and you hear from the NRA, we just need to enforce the gun laws on the books. It's time for that to stop being a slogan and actually be a principle, because the Bush administration has not enforced the laws on the books practically at all, and the Clinton administration was even worse. Both of them have a horrible record of enforcing the laws on the books. So essentially we have substituted a platitude for an actual policy. In 1993, Congress passed a law, it was the Brady Law, to require background checks at gun stores, at licensed gun stores. It was a law that I helped to write with my former boss, Chuck Schumer, and it was really the first time that there was any regulation on gun sales, any real regulation on gun sales. There had been some minor laws up until that point. What that law did, and what it illuminated when we also looked at crime gun traces, is that there is a pattern about where guns come from and where they end up when they're used in crime, and it's very simple. It's very simple. Guns that are used in crime come from states where the gun laws are the weakest. So you take a state like Ohio. Ohio has basically as weak as the gun laws in Ohio are as weak as any gun laws in the country. Ohio is a major gun trafficking source state. Guns are bought either from gun shows, because there's no background check for sales from unlicensed sellers at gun shows, or they come from straw buyers at Ohio gun stores, and they're trafficked to other parts of the country, mostly to western Pennsylvania, western New York, etc. If a gun is used in a crime in New York City, it came from Georgia, Florida, or Virginia. If a gun was used in crime in Missouri, it came from Kansas. Texas is a major gun trafficking source state. Mississippi guns end up in Illinois. So what we have is a situation where, because the gun laws vary from state to state to state, and because we have our floor on gun laws, on gun restrictions, is not enough really to prevent massive buying of guns without background checks and without any record of the sale, you have these routes that have developed, and they're very lucrative. You buy a gun from a gun store in Mississippi for $250, you're selling it for $800 in Chicago. It's a very good business. So what we need to do, and I believe that this is something that does not have any adverse impact on people's Second Amendment rights, I think it's well within the bounds of the Second Amendment, is we should at the very least require criminal background checks at gun shows, where people can now buy guns without a background check, and they can buy them in massive quantities. And the NRA estimates that several 100,000 are sold at gun shows without background checks each year. And we need to start enforcing the federal gun laws that are designed to break down this illegal gun market. And that's the laws dealing with corrupt gun stores. 32 prosecutions out of 100,000 stores is not enough. It is a pathetic regulatory scheme, and it's an indication that there's really no chance that you're going to be caught. There's no deterrent effect. Even though we know 90% of guns changed hands before they were used in crime, there were 197 gun trafficking cases. These are federal laws, 197 gun trafficking cases in all of 2002. Obliterated serial numbers, filing down the serial numbers so the gun can't be traced. Hundreds and hundreds were recovered in, I don't know about in Ohio. I know 677 were recovered in Chicago in 2002, 2 prosecutions. Stolen guns are a major part of the gun trafficking network, less than 200 prosecutions. So we need to close the handful of loopholes that make it possible for people to avoid background checks and to allow the gun trafficking market to flourish. We need to enforce the gun laws on the books, and we can do that, respect people's rights, and I believe you're going to see a major difference in gun crime in America, because this is the gun trafficking business, the business of taking guns from the legal market to the illegal market and supplying basically criminals in urban centers in exchange for drugs, which come back into rural areas. We've done so little on it that it's just had a chance to grow and grow and grow like a kudzu vine. So that's my basic affirmative response to why we need some more gun restrictions, and I think it's not an academic argument, it'll make a difference in people's lives.
Well, thank you all very much for inviting me and for coming here. I greatly appreciate it, and appreciate the chance to discuss these issues with Jim. Guns make it easier for bad things to happen, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves and prevent bad things from happening. And I think the question that unites everybody, whether it's Jim or myself, is what's the net effect? On net, do the presence of guns save lives or cost lives? And what impact do they have on the crimes that threaten people in many ways, from rape, robbery, and aggravated assault? When I go and talk to people, one comment that I frequently hear is that guns are just one issue where facts don't matter. There's just such an emotional debate. And I think that belittles the arguments on both sides. I think facts matter a lot. I think the question, though, isn't whether people are getting information. I think it's kind of the balance that they receive. Because guns are probably one issue where people are inundated with more facts than almost any other issue. I mean, you can't pick up a newspaper in the morning. You can't listen to the national or local evening news and not frequently hear about some type of crime that's been committed with guns. And I think when you talk about facts, I think you have to think about it much more broadly than simple numbers. Because when you go and give a number, that's just one type of information. People, they're inundated with this, and a number just kind of falls into the sea of information that they think from personal experiences. I think people have a pretty good idea of the costs of guns. Jim went through some of the costs that are there. In 2001, there were about 300,000 crimes committed with guns. If you look at surveys that are done, it indicates about 450,000 times that year guns were used in commission of crimes, over 8,000 gun murders. Yet I don't think people have as good of an idea of the benefits that are there. During that same year, for example, the best estimates that we have indicate that people use guns defensively about 2 million times a year. That's about 4 or 5 times more frequently than people use guns to stop crime than they were used in the commission of crime. 90-some% of those times, simply brandishing a gun was sufficient to cause a criminal to go and break off an attack. My guess is, though, if you were going to ask people what their perceptions are about how frequently guns are used in crime as compared to how many times they're used to stop them, if anything, they'd have massive ratios going in the other direction. And I think that's pretty understandable. I mean, why it's pretty easy for most people to go and readily recall crimes that are committed with guns or bad things that are happening. I mean, just without trying too hard, you probably can recall what seem to be hundreds or thousands of stories that you've heard about bad things happening with guns. My guess is it's pretty hard for you to recall the last time you watched the national news, for example, and heard a story about someone using a gun to protect themselves or protect somebody else. It's understandable that it's hard for you to recall those types of things, even despite how frequently these things take place. For 2001, one thing I did was I looked at news coverage of guns, not only in the top 100 newspapers, but also on the national television news. And if you look at ABC, NBC, and CBS during that year, you'll find that there were about 180,000, 190,000 words worth of stories on gun crimes. By contrast, there was not one single story on either the morning or evening news broadcasts for any of these national networks that in any way mentioned even a single incident of a citizen using a gun to protect himself, protect somebody else. You look at something like the New York Times, for example, that year. They had about 51,000 words worth of stories on gun crimes. And yet during that year, they only had one single story about a former retired police officer who had used his gun to stop a robbery at a gasoline station. You look at the top 3 newspapers in size, USA Today, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And between the 3 of them, they had only that one story of a citizen using a gun to be able to protect themselves. And I think that has a big impact on people's perceptions about the costs and benefits of guns. I think a lot of this imbalance can be explained, though, without any type of conspiracy theory. I mean, take 2 stories and pretend you were an editor of a paper. And let's say in one case there's a story where there's a dead body on the ground, a sympathetic person like a victim. In another case, let's say a woman brandishes a gun, the would-be attacker runs away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, no crime actually committed. I think any of us in that position as an editor would pick the first story, where there's a dead body on the ground, sympathetic victim, as being a lot more newsworthy than the second story. We may care about both of those cases from a policy perspective in terms of the total number of lives that are saved or lost, but we can surely understand the decision in terms of newsworthiness. And I think that explains a lot, given that maybe 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing it's sufficient to go and cause a criminal to break off an attack. I don't think that explains everything, though, and there's some real anomalies that happen there. For example, there are many crimes that are considered to be extremely newsworthy, that are getting national and international coverage. And yet, when those crimes involve an individual stopping with a gun, that particular part of the story is systematically left out of coverage. So, for example, my guess is that relatively few people here know that about 30% of the public school shootings since October 97 were stopped by citizens with guns well before the police were able to arrive. And the reason why you're unlikely to know that is that in the stories of those attacks, only about 1% or so of those news stories will actually mention that a gun was used to stop the attack. You can take the first of the public school shootings, for example, one in Pearl, Mississippi, in October 97, when 2 students were killed. There was an assistant principal there at the school who had a permit to carry a concealed handgun. Prior to the 1995 Safe School Zone Act, in fact, would many times carry the gun with him. After that law got passed in which banned guns within 1,000 feet of the school. He would go and park his car off the school property, a quarter of a mile. When the attack started that day, he literally had to run a half mile across school property, an additional quarter mile, go and get his gun, a half mile to come back, point his gun at the attacker, held him there at point blank range for 5.5 minutes before the police arrived. Now, if you go and do, during law school students here, or lawyers, you know there's something called Lexis, which is a computerized database of news stories around the country. And what you find is that 1 month after that attack, 687 separate news stories about the incident. Of those, only 19 mentioned the assistant principal in any way. Only 13 of the 19 mentioned that he actually that he helped him stop the attack. And only 10 of the 13 stories mentioned he actually used a gun to stop the attack. 8 of those were in small local newspapers near where the attack occurred. The other 2 was ABC News at 4 a.m. in the morning, and they were overnight news broadcast that had about a sentence on it. And CNN the following day on the early prime also had a sentence on it. And I can go through other public school type shootings. You have other cases. You had an attack about 2 years ago at Appalachian Law School that occurred while I was writing my book on why someone's done, so I looked into it more than I would normally look into these things. In which 3 people were killed during the attack. When it started, there were 2 students there at the school, both former deputy sheriffs and earlier who ran to their cars, got their pistols, came back, pointed their guns at the attack, ordered to drop his gun. When he did so, a 3rd student tackled him, and they wrestled him to the ground and held him there for over 11 minutes before the police arrived. Again, if you do an Nexus type search on it, what you'll find is that about 218 separate stories ignoring APs where these things get repeated over and over again. Of those 218 stories, only 7 mentioned the students had guns in any way to stop the attack, but only 3 of them mentioned that the students used their guns to stop them. All 3 local newspapers near where the attack had occurred. Now, one thing I decided to do when I saw this was to call up the newspaper reporters who had written stories on this, to try to find out, 1, what they knew about the facts, and 2, why they decided to report the way they did. Because its typical stories would be like in the Washington Post, which would say the students pounced on the attack, or the New York Daily News, which would say the students tackled the attack, or AP, which said they subdued them. And the amazing thing to me was that time after time, all the reporters not only knew about the fact, but it actually interviewed either 1 or both of the students who had been involved in stopping them with their guns. And when I go and ask them, for example, Major Maria Lott at the Washington Post, who had interviewed 1 of the students for over 10 minutes, and the other one she interviewed for just a couple minutes, why she had barely mentioned the students pounced on the attack. I mean, which is true. I mean, it's literally true. But I think it misses an important part of the story there. And maybe it gives people a misimpression because somehow it convinces you that maybe it's safe to go and charge somebody across open ground and make a gun. That the explanation I got from her and I got from the other reporters was pretty consistent. Like, she had space constraints, that she only had 930 words to do the story, and simply only had enough space to mention the students pounced on the attacker and didn't have enough room to go and mention that they used their guns to stop. Now, if you think about this from a newsworthiness perspective, I mean, I mentioned how newsworthiness can explain why a lot of these stories don't get covered. In fact, if anything, I think it works in the other direction. I mean, what's going to be more likely to go and grab readers' attention? To go and say that the students pounced on the attack or something vague that they subdued them? Or to say the students used their guns to stop the attack? My guess is readers would be actually more likely to have their attention riveted to it, to be more likely to talk about it to each other. And yet you don't see that coming. And I can go through lots of other cases like that. I'll just go through another type of example of this bias more briefly, something that Jim was alluding to and glad brought up. And that's the rate of actual gun deaths involving kids. I mean, it's not only the media, but I'm sure a lot of you have seen the public service ads that were put out by the Trump administration during the 90s, which would show the voices and pictures of young children between the ages of 4 and 8. Never a voice or a picture of a child over age 8. These ads literally ran tens of thousands of times across the country, and giving people the impression that there's an epidemic of actual gun deaths in the home involving young children. And in 2001, for example, normally I would ask people what they think the numbers are on these things, and as Jim correctly alluded to, people have this impression that these are fairly high rates. For children under age 10, kind of corresponding to the ones in these ads, there were 32 children under age 10 who died of maximum gunshot. For children under age 15, I don't think 16 memorized, but it was 76. So, sorry about the one here, but the typical case, in part because these ads in the news stores, they think that it's a young child getting hold of a gun and accidentally killing another child or themselves. In fact, what we did is you can get these numbers from the Centers for Disease Control. Their website, Mortality Morbidity Report, has these numbers broken down in amazing detail by year of age, by state it occurred, by type of gun that was involved in the crime. And what we did was we took each of those cases, essentially did a nexus search to pull down all the newspaper stories on each one of those cases. And what you find is that in the 7 years from 1995 through 2001, you find that there was on average about 8.5 cases a year, around about 9, where a child under 10 either accidentally shot themselves or another child under 10. In fact, by far the typical case was an adult male, usually in his mid-20s, who has a history of arrests and convictions for violent crime, who was either a drug addict, an alcoholic, and other strange things that we talk about, who is the typical person who accidentally fired a gun. We won't go into what that basically implies for different types of laws that you can be talking about. But I get calls from the media from time to time. And one thing that's come up is I get asked about the states that try to pass these safe storage laws. And I've kind of taken to asking reports about that. Why it is that this one particular type of death gets so much more coverage relative to other types of deaths that occur. Because when you think about it, I mean, as Jim said, any of these deaths are tragic. I have 5 kids. I can't imagine what it'd be like losing any of my kids for any reason. But it's a bit of a puzzle why this one type of death gets so much coverage. I mean, when you think about it, when you think about the fact that about 40 million kids under age 10 in the United States, that there's about 95, 96 million Americans that live in homes with own gun adults that live in homes with own guns, I would argue it's pretty hard to get almost any other type of item. This is commonly known in American homes that has as few accidental deaths that are associated with it. You have more children under age 5 who drowned in 5-gallon plastic water bottles, 36 in the last year that I have data. And you have children under age 10 who died from anti-infectious gunshots. You have more children under age 5 who drowned in bathtubs, 93 in 2001. Then you had children under age 15 who died from anti-infectious gunshots. And, when you think about this, so I would go and ask those reporters, why it is that they concentrate on this one type of story? The response I would get back, to the extent that I did respond, well, because it's so rare that dog bites man is much more of a news story than man bites dog. And I guess I have a couple responses. One is, I mean, it's true it's rare, but I can give you lots of very rare, very gruesome ways that children die. They're rare, as rare, slightly less rare to accident like that. They don't even get local news coverage, let alone national news coverage. Everything from various types of decapitations to children being crushed in combines on farms and other very gruesome ways that they die. But I think the more important issue is that even if it's true that the reason why this one particular type of death gets so much coverage is because it's so rare, I don't think that's the impression that most people get when they go and watch the news coverage. You don't go and watch these news stories and come away and thinking, geez, this was covered because it's such an incredibly rare event. I think most people come away with this thinking this is something that threatens children's lives and something that we should be concerned about in terms of the rate it threatens kids. Now, there are other things I could go into and talk about the media, but I just thought I'd really briefly just talk about some of the other ways we get perceptions. One thing is just looking at polls. Like I mentioned government reports too. Government reports I'll just mention. I couldn't find one single federal government report from the Justice Department or the Treasury in the 15 years before I did my book that didn't mention any type of benefit. Every year you'll have just a trivial example. You'll have something like, they'll go and say, top 10 gun choices in crime. Why not one year have a report that will go and show something like a top 10 gun choice defensively by people to protect themselves? So look at something like Poland. Probably the most balanced poll is something that Jim alluded to, for example, which would go and ask, do you favor enforcing existing gun control laws, or do you favor new gun control laws? If you look at that, about 2/3 of people think that you should enforce existing. But if you think about that type of survey, both of those answers imply what? They both imply that we think gun control is good, right? I mean, those are resources. We could be spending them on other types of policing activity. We could go and be using those to lower the tuition here at Ohio State. We could go and use it to lower taxes if we didn't go and spend the money on something like that. And so you wouldn't do either of those unless you thought it was a net benefit. You have other types of surveys that are done at NBC, which would regularly have a survey that say, do you think gun control is used to try a lot, a little bit, or somewhat, or just a little bit. I couldn't find one of those types of surveys that would allow people to go and say that maybe gun control might be counterproductive. And the problem that you face with these things, maybe it's just my training as an economist, is that all laws can have both costs and benefits that occur. And the problem that you face is that when you pass a law, if it's primarily the law-abiding good citizens that disarm, relative to criminals, you can actually see increases in crime rather than drops. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples before we finish up. One is, look at something very simple like waiting periods. Waiting periods can produce a benefit in terms of cooling off the benefit. But they could also, and it's something you want to take into consideration if you're going to study this, but waiting periods could also make it difficult for a woman, let's say, who's being stalked or threatened, from being able to quickly be able to go and get a gun to be able to defend herself. When in fact, if you look at the data on this, you don't find, there's no academic study that I know that shows that waiting periods are associated with any type of reduction in violent crime. There's some studies, not all by any means, that show that even short waiting periods are associated with increases in rape rates. When you start getting past about 10 days or so, you start seeing increases in violent crime rates across the board. Let me give you something that's probably more controversial, probably the most controversial example I can give. And as I mentioned earlier, these safe school zone acts. We all want to go and try to protect the kids. I mean, it's hardly a more emotional issue that can be there. And surely the notion of just banning guns from a particular area would seem like an obvious course of action. But the problem you have to ask yourself is, by going past a law like that that bans guns from particular areas, who are the people who are most likely to ban it? The people who may be, let's say, law-abiding, concealed handguns, or those who are intent on trying to commit some type of carnage there. So, for example, let's say somebody was threatening you or your family. One thing to think about, when you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said this home is a gun-free zone, you think that would make it more or less likely that the person there would want to go and attack the home. And I think most of us have a gut reaction. That would be a pretty silly thing to go and do. If I go and impose a 3-year prison term for somebody taking a gun on your school property, a law-abiding, concealed handgun permit holder facing a felony like that would completely change their life to go and have something like that occur. That would be a real penalty for them. But somebody who's intent on creating carnage and trying to kill or maim multiple people who may be facing multiple life sentences, that additional penalty may not really mean very much. And the problem is that in this extreme case, when you go and ban guns from these areas, if it's the law-abiding good citizens who don't violate the law, but the criminal who's intent on doing the harm, that unintentionally, rather than creating a safe zone for our kids, you may unintentionally be creating a safe zone for the criminal who wants to go and do the attack because he's less to worry about, just like with your sign in front of your home. You may realize that that may be more likely to cause him who's willing to break in to commit the crime because he has less to worry about in terms of committing the crime. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
John, as usual, made some very interesting points, but I also think that some of what he said illustrates what I think is just some. But some of what he said, I think, also illustrates what I think is the problem with the gun debate, which is this. Look, there is nobody that really is out there saying, look, we have 250 million guns in private hands right now. 8 million guns are sold each year to individuals through licensed gun stores that we know about. 47% of households have a gun in the home. You know, if we got to 350 million guns in private hands, is our crime rate going to go down or up? You know, if 70% of households have a gun in the home, is our crime rate going to go down or up? If we're selling 12 million guns each year, is our crime rate going down or up? You know, I don't know the answer to that question, because in my view, and, you know, when you look at some of these situations like the school shootings, and, you know, John made a good point about, and we both made the same point about, you know, accidental deaths at home, that's not the gun crime problem in America. The gun crime in America is not Columbine, and it's not the Jonesboro School. They happen, but they are as rare as the kid who drowns in the 5-gallon tub. You know, the gun crime in America, such as it is a problem where really people in certain areas of the country are really menaced by violence. You know, in much of the country, there is a very relatively small gun crime problem. You know, or specifically, there's a small crime problem. You know, when you get outside the domestic violence area. If you live in an area where I live in Washington, D.C., and I live in a okay neighborhood in Washington, D.C., I mean, crime really is a daily consideration. You know, I call it the urban tax. You know, it's one broken car window and a smashed side view mirror every 6 months. You know, and that's just the tax you pay for the love of living in the wonderful city that I live in. But crime truly is a problem. The purpose of gun laws shouldn't be to make it gratuitously more difficult for law-abiding citizens to buy guns. The purpose of gun laws need to be to deliver results that have a positive impact on people's lives. And, you know, John was saying, well, you know, there aren't measurements about sort of defensive uses of guns, whether it's good or bad, and that sort of thing. Look, law-abiding citizens, 47% of voting households in America have made the decision that, yes, I think owning a gun makes me safer. 53% of households have made the decision, no, I don't think a gun makes me safer. Each side has exercised their right in a way in which, in their own mind, they've made an informed decision about what to do. If they knew that, that gun accidents in the home are rare, and frankly, they're less rare because people have changed their storage behavior, yeah, maybe you'd see a slight uptick in gun ownership. But I think the problem, when I point to my side on the left, is there isn't a gun law they don't love, okay? There isn't a gun restriction that they just wouldn't just grab onto like a life preserver. Because I think the problem on my side is that there hasn't been a real good analysis of how criminals get guns, frankly, until our group came along and really looked at the patterns, how criminals do actually get guns. So I believe that there is a place where law-abiding families can own guns to protect themselves, that people can exercise their gun rights, but we are doing what is necessary to shut down, to make it difficult to navigate the black market, that is difficult to buy a gun without some sort of background check, without some sort of record in some way, and then an aggressive federal prosecution to go after the illegal market in guns. And the problem is these laws aren't local laws, they're federal laws. They're cross-jurisdictional, they're cross-state lines. So, it's always easy on the gun debate to go into this left-right polemic about guns are all good or guns are all bad. The fact of the matter is it is a tool, it is a neutral until it's in the right hands or the wrong hands.
How long? 30 seconds? Okay. Anyway, I want to say, I agree with Jim on some points. I mean, the thing about gun crime and how it's being concentrated, I don't think most people appreciate the fact that about half the counties in the United States have 0 murders in any given year, and that you have about 70% of the murders are concentrated in about 3.5% of the counties. I mean, it's very heavily concentrated in a relatively small area. And one can go and talk about drug gangs and other types of things that I think overwhelmingly account for a lot of this. I mean, if you have, and I think you can explain a fair amount of the change over the 90s, for example, just as the returns for people engaging in drug trades and other things. And I think that's also one thing maybe one could talk about, some of the differences across countries. Just mention D.C., since he did mention that D.C. is one place where it's banned in terms of guns. And it's interesting to see how the crime rates changed before and after 1976. In the 5 years prior to 1976, the murder rates in D.C. were falling from 37 per 100,000 to 27 per 100,000 people. In the 5 years afterwards, they then went up from 27 to 3,500. 35 per 100,000 people. Now, as I try to say at the beginning, bad things happen with guns, and guns also make it easier for bad things to happen, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves. You know, everybody wants to try to take guns away from people. You know, I think both of us want to try to do the exact same thing. The question is what works, and that's what we can get around these issues. You know, I would love if background checks work. I mean, it's such a simple, obvious solution. I guess I don't mind doing it because it takes resources. That doesn't seem to do much harm. But I don't know of one academic study that's found that the Brady Act, for example, is reduced violent crime. Now, I know a lot of people who might support these types of things will say, well, it's because the Brady Act had all sorts of loopholes and it just wasn't broad enough to enforce this thing. That wasn't the type of argument that was brought up when the law was first passed. I looked at gun show regulations across states, and I think I think it's fine any impact that they have but the only impact that I've been able to find with regard to gun show regulations is that you see about a 20% drop in the number of gun shows in the state, and that seems like that could be a real cost that you want to try to penetrate for whether or not it's going to happen. In fact, the first time I met Jim, one of the suggestions I was making to him was that, well, maybe there might be a compromise to the years since then. He really believes that gun show regulations reduce violent crime. As I say, I'm really skeptical. The response to the other side is that, well, these are costly, impose costs on people. So maybe if you believe it's going to reduce it, why not pick up the cost if you're imposing upon the people who are selling the guns to compensate for that? And then in some sense it would be a win-win type situation. And there may be political problems in terms of convincing people that you won't take away those payments as soon as the thing gets passed. But at least it seems like that type of discussion would at least make it more likely that everybody could be made better off if, in fact, and get the law passed if that's really wants to be there. The gun tracing, and I'm going to be running out in a minute or two, but I'll just mention a couple things with regard to that, and that is, he mentioned that about a third of the guns were 3 years old. They're basically this time to crime type thing. There's a lot of debate over these types of numbers, the types of numbers that came out during the Clinton administration. One of the things that they didn't trace all the guns. They traced guns essentially over about a 6-year period of time, and that were sold over the previous 6 years. And of those, they could find that those that were sold over this 3-year period were, made up about a third of these things. If you want to pick any period of time where you can say, I'm just going to study guns that were sold over the last 3 years, for example, and see what percentage of guns that were sold over the last 3 years, were involved in crime that I'm tracing, then it'd be 100%. So essentially you go and kind of arbitrarily pick how you're going to define this window. You can get any percentage that you want within a certain range there. I just mentioned this other thing. When he talks about 100,000 licensed gun dealers, and that being more than the number of McDonald's, there are a couple things, because my guess is most of you go driving around, you don't see as many gun stores as you see McDonald's, and there's a very simple reason for that. A lot of these dealers are just private individuals, who have a license to do that. They're not stores or something like that you would go to. A lot of these people may only sell 5, 6, 7 guns over the course of the year. You have maybe police officers in a police department that may serve as something to go and get guns for other officers on the force that are there. But one thing I will say, just in concluding, one of the things that Jim has done, which I think is good, is raising the general issue about enforcement and how much these different types of laws are being enforced. And I think those are types of empirical questions that one can get into. But I would take it the next step. Rather than just going and seeing whether they're enforced, I would go and say, why do we care about this? And what needs to be done is to see what impact that has on crime rates per se, rather than just talking about whether the rules aren't being enforced or not.
We've had a sign malfunction.
Sorry, I'm sure they paid good money.
Just shows that duct tape does not solve all problems. John was right. Gun crimes are concentrated in about 3% of counties in America. But where they come from, where those guns come from that are used in those crimes are very much spread out. And it's one of the problems with the enforcement area. Where the violent crime is committed and where the first crime in which that gun goes into from the legal to the illegal market are two entirely different jurisdictions, often different states, and also often jurisdictions that have a different type of crime problem. And it is, unfortunately, it should be the role of the federal government here, but they don't do much on it. It's very hard to convince somebody in rural Georgia that they should care about a crime, a gun that was bought in their jurisdiction, or lots of guns that are bought in their jurisdiction, where the closest crime that was committed was 800 miles away. So that is one of the major problems that we have on this. I want to make a point about D.C. because I live there, and D.C. is a source of ironic pride for me. The reason why the crime rate went up has nothing to do with the D.C. gun ban, which is a ridiculous law. The reason why the crime rate went up in D.C. is that our mayor at the time, Marion Barry, was a crack addict. And if you have a crack addict who's a criminal as your mayor, your entire city is going to fall apart, trust me. Do background checks work? Yes, they do. Yeah, there are loopholes in the Brady Law. And the reason why there's loopholes in the Brady Law is in Congress, you've passed whatever you can with the amount of votes that you can get. I mean, these laws are never going to be perfect on an issue like this. There's just too much polarization on this issue, so everything's going to be a compromise. But, and this is also the reason why I know that gun shows are a problem. Gun shows where they don't have background checks for all sales. All of the states that are high source states where guns come from that are used in crimes committed in other states, by far, the vast majority of those guns, whether it's on a per capita basis and any type of basis that you want to look at, come from states where the gun show loophole is open. It is if your business is to sell illegal guns, and you can make a great living off of it if you don't get caught, and I hate to say this, you won't get caught, okay? You just won't. So, I mean, if you're looking for how to make some illegal cash and not get caught, this is except for the danger of having to deal with other criminals, it's pretty easy to do. You go to a gun show, you buy guns from an unlicensed seller, you buy, I don't know, 10 of them, you pay $2,500 for them, you go to another jurisdiction, a place like New York City or Philadelphia or Detroit or Chicago or St. Louis, and you sell it for probably, somewhere between $500 and $1,000 a piece. I mean, at minimum, you're going to double your money, and you can do it, every couple of weeks. So what you're seeing is New York, if you're in New York State, which has pretty strict gun laws, 25% of the guns that are traced to crimes committed in New York State come from New York State. The other 75% are from out of state, And nearly all of them are from the 5 southeastern southern states. And these aren't, John was talking about what, Clinton administration with their traces. These are the numbers that are the same for each of the years, 1996 through 2002, because I have the trace data for all of it, and it's remarkably similar. Illinois, it's always between 45 and 55% of their crime guns come from out of state. Mississippi is always number 1. It's not an accident. And the only state that has the gun show loophole closed, which is a fairly significant source of crime guns, is California, and that's just because California is so enormous. So, as I said before, the purpose of passing these laws is not to gratuitously make it more difficult for law-abiding citizens to buy guns. If the laws aren't going to work, if you don't see some sort of evidence that it's reducing crime or making it more difficult for the black market to work, it shouldn't be in existence. I agree, these safe storage laws, they probably fall somewhere in between insignificant and Zippo in terms of having an effect. But it's not, the crime rate began to drop in this nation starting in 1993, and it has gone way, 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 way down. I don't think the Brady Law is the major reason for it. We put 100,000 cops on the street. We had stiffer prison sentences. We did all sorts of other things. We had after-school programs. But we also had the first federal law in which we required background checks in some place, and we at least, at that point, took the illegal gun market and forced it underground. At least we were successful in doing that and forcing it into the gun show market, where at least you can send law enforcement officials into the 4,000 gun shows that are held each year.
Marion Barry was mayor in the 70s?
He was mayor for 16 years.
Right, I know, but it was, anyway, I don't think it was.
4 years in between when he
Yeah,
was
I
in
think
prison.
there are other problems. I mean, I'm more than happy to go and argue that there are other problems with D.C. I mean, just the quality of the policing services and other things changed that were there. I don't want to argue that the gun control laws had the same thing, but I think if you look across countries, they go and pass different types of restrictive gun control measures. It's very hard, very rare that you see any type of drop in crime. You pretty much consistently see increases that occur after that. Just nationwide, as an aside, our violent crime rate started falling in 1991. In 93, even if it's that, if you want to argue that, it was still before the Brady Act went into effect. But, there's lots of laws that have been passed to try to go and deal with this type of trafficking. One gun a month rules, for example. I don't know of a study that's found that the passage of one gun a month rules has reduced violent crime rates, whether it's in the state that passed it or in neighboring states or in other states that are farther away. I'll just give you kind of an extreme view of this gun trafficking type of issue. You have some countries, for example, like England, which banned handguns in January 97. And yet, since January 97, the Home Office just came out with a report earlier this year where they showed that in 5 years after its banning, gun crime had gone up well over 100% during that period of time. And, the problem is, here you have a kind of an ideal situation. We have an island nation, okay? It's relatively easy compared to anything else to go and protect your borders that are going to be there, to try to make sure smuggling's not going to be there. But I'm not going to go and argue that developing gun crime is because we ban handguns. But what I will say is that there are other things that are very important. One of the things that's important is the drug crimes, drug trafficking, drug gangs. When you have something today, such as being able to control an area to go and sell your drugs, you can't go and call the police when another drug gang comes in and invades your church. You don't say, you ask me to move my area. What essentially happens is people go and set up their own little militaries in order to try to protect their church. And in Britain, they can go and smuggle drugs into the country to go and sell. They surely don't seem to have much trouble going and smuggling in the guns to be able to go and defend that drug. And given the huge percentage of gun murders in this small area in Canada, drug gangs despite great intentions to go and try and control these things. Otherwise, these same types of gangs, just like in England, are going to find ways around these types of things to go and bring in these rules. And the question is, who's going to be most adversely affected? You're going to have things like one gun, one rule. There's cost to those. You can pose difficulties on law-abiding individuals. And I don't, again, the bottom line to me is looking to see what impact this has on crimes. One thing that was brought up earlier that I wanted to allude to was cross-country comparisons. The countries that were mentioned were Canada, England, Japan, for example. I'm not sure France, another country. And usually the claim is if you look at those countries, compare to the United States is relatively high gun ownership rate, relatively high murder rate, and then somehow the implication is that one drives the other. In fact, if you look across the world, there are many countries that have gun ownership rates similar to or higher than what we have here in the United States that have much lower murder rates. Switzerland, for example, has a gun possession rate that's about 20% higher than we do. Even, beside the fact that all able-bodied males between the ages of 18 and 42 are required to use a machine gun. And Switzerland has traditionally had one of the lowest, if not probably the lowest murder rate in Europe. You have a country like Israel, for example, that probably has by far the highest gun possession rate in the world. And yet Israel has traditionally had one of the lowest murder rates. In fact, if you go and look at all the countries to which the data is available, what you tend to find is that those countries with the strictest gun control laws tend to have relatively higher homicide rates. And the 10 countries that either completely ban or almost completely ban guns, with the highest homicide rates, either completely ban or almost completely ban guns. I don't put a lot of weight on the cross-sectional data, but if you follow jurisdictions over time and see the changes in different places before and after, it has these types of gun controls. I would argue you tend to see an increase. And again, there are lots of other factors that need to be tried to account for. One that I see in U.S. data is that we have 50 different laboratories plus the District of Columbia. We can try to account for some of these things, where maybe whether or not they forces, have good police departments or other things that can be affected.
One of the things that John had mentioned earlier is about polling, and I agree. I think polling data is not real illuminating on the gun issue. But our organization did polling that, we really try and find out what people are thinking as opposed to what we want people to think. And one of the questions that we did ask is, do you think that gun laws in America are too strict, too lax, or about right? And there was about 4% who thought that gun laws in America were too strict, and you basically had a 2/3 to 1/3 majority that felt that gun laws in America were too lax. I don't think these polls tell you all that much. I mean, what does it mean to be too strict? What does it mean to be too lax? The issue in this country isn't whether we are going to ban guns. Even in Washington, D.C., where they have the D.C. gun ban. I mean, look, D.C. is not a petri dish. There's no way to stop guns from coming in or out of Washington, D.C. The question isn't whether we are going to ban guns in this country. There are 250 million in private hands. We have a Second Amendment that, while Supreme Court justices in the future might debate back and forth about what it allows individuals to possess and purchase, it certainly allows something. The question is, given the public policy question is that given the crime problem that we have in America, 300,000 to 400,000 gun crimes in a good year, somewhere between 8 and 10,000 gun homicides each year, that these gun crimes tend to be concentrated into certain areas, that where the guns come from and where the guns used are in very different places, that the guns seem to be coming from places where there is a certain laxness in the laws, particularly as it pertains, I would say, to gun shows, that I agree with John. Let's not pass a law because we hope it's going to work, or let's not keep a law because we hope it's going to work. We should pass a law because we think it is going to work, and then we should measure it to see in some ways that if it does work. To me, the fact to me is that in a given year, about 2,000 guns from Ohio, bought in Ohio, are recovered in crimes in other states. And about 180 guns that are bought in New York State are recovered in other states. Or that 3,000 guns that are bought in Georgia are recovered in other states. But only 300 from Missouri are recovered in other states. Says there is something definitely going on. We do have 50 different labs. And the labs are telling us something. Yeah, North Dakota has weak gun laws. Yeah, North Dakota isn't a major source of crime guns. But there's something else about North Dakota that makes it a little bit unique. It is remote. But when you get into the areas where it's not remote, you look at the Indianas, and I would say Indianapolis, that's one of the gun trafficking centers of the universe, and a major drug trafficking center. Indiana and Ohio and Georgia and Florida and Virginia and Kansas and Mississippi and a few other states that you see they're in the midst of interstate highways. There's connections, maybe immigration connections between certain regions, like Mississippi and Illinois have an immigration connection. And that we're seeing something here over and over and over and over again, which is the guns are coming from one place and they're going to the other. We have to figure out a way to stop that. I believe that ultimately it protects people's rights. I believe you close the gun show loophole, you tinker with a few other laws to make it easier to prosecute gun traffickers and people using guns with obliterated serial numbers and people using stolen guns and in the commission of felonies, and you do a couple of things, you might put John Lott and Jim Kessler out of business. Because I don't think that we need to do what Japan has done or what England has done, which is basically, ban the private possession of guns. And I also don't believe that in a society in which we already have 250 million guns in private hands and half the households with a gun in the home, that we need to say, like, look, it is too restrictive for you to get a gun. We need to make it easier for you to protect yourself. People have already been able to do that and have made their choice. We need to stop this illicit market. We're not doing it.
Thanks. First of all, I just want to thank Jim for the discussion today. Jim and I may disagree on everything from the assault weapons ban to gun show regulations, the Brady Act, but at least we have a reasonable discussion on these types of issues. I think, the impact of gun control laws, you have to think about this. I mean, the bottom line is who's most likely to be affected or obey the rules. Because, again, the bottom line is that if you primarily, intentionally or unintentionally, take guns away from law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, I think the rules can often have the opposite impact of what you would like them to have. Let me give you a simple example to illustrate what the cost of guns again. Something Jim and I both talked about, that'd be safe storage laws. You have like 17 states now that make it a crime if you store a gun in such a way that a juvenile gets hold of it and uses it improperly. So, in most of the states, it's a misdemeanor. There's a few words of felony. And we understand the motivations for these types of laws. I mean, there's accidental gun deaths, exactly. We all like to see them reduced. And the claim is, though it's not made as strongly, that well, maybe these rules would reduce crime because of the barrel lock or trigger lock and make it more difficult for someone who steals a gun and uses it in crime. And there's also some arguments that maybe it could prevent suicide. But when you go and look at the data, you don't see any of those types of evidence. And I think when you do look at the data, it'll become pretty clear very quickly why you don't get those benefits. If you just take something like the accidental gun deaths, I argue basically have two different types of households. You have a law-abiding household where the risk of accidental gun deaths are extremely rare. You're talking about something that's akin to children in those households dying from lightning strikes. To the extent to which these rare events occur, they tend to basically take place in these households with an adult criminal who's accidentally firing the gun. So the question you have to ask is, I pass this law, who's likely to obey it? Which household is going to go and change his behavior? And what I would argue is that basically it's a law-abiding household where the risk of these accidental gun deaths occurring is essentially zero. They're the ones that you see two things happening. One is there's about a 5 or 6 percentage point drop right when these laws get passed in the rate of people own guns. And then over time, over the 5 years afterwards, you'll see people going from about 30% storing their guns locked and unloaded to about 70%. But since those are the households that there's not a problem to begin with, you don't see a reduction. The households where there is a problem, when you have these adult criminals firing guns, the problem that you face there is, one is, these guys, it's illegal for them to own these guns, many of them, in the case to begin with. Somehow it's illegal, but they're locking the gun. But even if that wasn't the case, gun laws are simply not designed to stop an adult male from accidentally firing his own gun. It may stop access for a juvenile, but it's the adults that are accidentally firing the guns and killing the children in this case. What you do see, though, after these laws get passed, is as gun ownership rates go down, as guns become less accessible, you actually see increases in crime in the home. Criminals become emboldened to attack people in their homes, and the likelihood of a successful crime occurring actually increases. Let me just give you a simple comparison between two countries. There's something called hot burglaries. These are burglaries that occur while residents are in the dwelling. In the United States, the hot burglary rate's about 13%. In a country like England, for example, it's about 59%. Almost 6 out of every 10 times a burglary takes place in where the residents are there. When they do surveys of convicted burglars, American burglars spend about twice as long as their British counterparts encasing a home before they break in. Why do they do that? Well, the reason why the burglars give is that American burglars want to make sure nobody's there because they're worried about getting shot. The British counterparts aren't concerned about that. So it's not too surprising when we have laws in the United States that make it hard for people to go into defend themselves. Our burglars became more like their British counterparts. Now, we can go on with this, but the bottom line is that there's just a couple points. One is police are extremely important in protecting us. They're probably the single most important factor for this crime. But even though police are so important, I think something the police themselves understand is that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime has been committed. And the question becomes, what do you advise someone to do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? Simply telling somebody to behave passively is not very good advice. The second thing that I would point out is who benefits the most from having guns. And I would argue it tends to be the most vulnerable people in our society. It tends to be people relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, who benefit the most from having a gun for protection. And also people who are most likely to be victims of crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime areas. It'd be great if the police were there to protect them, but they're not. And the question you have to grapple with is, what do you tell these people to do when they're having to protect themselves from a criminal? Just telling them to behave passively is not very good advice. Thank you very much. Thanks.
I think we should give both of our answers.
You showed admirable restraint. It was almost like we were having a televised presidential debate and you were told not to respond. But I think both of them did an excellent job. Not to respond after each speech. Otherwise, they would have applauded for your work and for your getting the sign back up. So we appreciated that, too. Yeah, I did. So now we have 20 minutes for Q&A, and this is your time. And so I don't know if we have microphones out there, do we? Yeah, we have them out on each side. So if you get up and line up at the microphones, and then we'll just take you in order as you're out there. We'll start with this gentleman here who raised his hand first. And go ahead.
Well, thank you for the debate. Is this working? Thank you for the debate. Enjoyed it. Is it working? I'd like to thank you, and got several questions, but Mr. Kessler, you keep talking about the trafficking of guns. if there were no trafficking, it sounds like we would have two classes of citizens, the ones that live in the areas where you can buy guns and the ones that have difficulties living in areas where it's difficult to get one. The other thing is, if you want to end the trafficking, loosen up the gun laws in the other spot. There won't be any trafficking. You can buy guns where they're at.
We live in a country where states and localities are able to pass laws that they think are best for them. I mean, that's, part of the 10th Amendment. And thank you very much. If you live in a state like New York, if you live in Maryland, if you live in a lot of these other states that are recipient states, Illinois, look, you can buy a gun in those states. If you're a law-abiding citizen, you can buy a gun. It might not be quite as convenient as in Ohio. In Illinois, you're probably going to have to wait a couple weeks. In New York, you're probably going to have to wait a couple weeks. Same with Massachusetts. But it's not the law-abiding citizen that's getting guns trafficked to them from Georgia and then buying them off the streets and paying top dollar for it. This is a criminal enterprise. And look, if you're talking about loosening the laws, all you'd have to do to loosen the laws so that you don't have a gun trafficking problem is open the gun show loophole. That's the one that seems to turn a state from being a donor state to a recipient state.
Want me to respond? Yeah. Well, I think I generally commented on this during the talk, but I just mentioned the gun show loophole. Again, I don't find any evidence that it matters. We have a number of states that go and restrict the private transfers of guns, and this applies to gun shows. My guess is a lot of the people who push for a literal gun show loophole type closure are going to be the same ones who are going to be talking about some new loophole that's going to be created after the law gets passed, because it says you ban the transfer of guns other than through some type of background check in a gun show. But criminals who want to go and transfer can transfer it outside them. And so you're going to be talking about private transfers generally. And then the question is going to be, how are you going to make sure you're going to be able to monitor or try to keep track of all the private transfers that are there? And then you're going to have issues like registration and licensing and things like that. I think just to try to make it enforceable, those are the types of issues you're going to have to deal with. Now, if you want to go and talk about registration and licensing so we can keep track of the guns that are privately owned by people, so we can begin to go and have some type of enforceable mechanism on the private transfers of guns, then we can go and talk about that. But I would think this is going to be like a lot of these things. We're going to pass this. It's not going to have an impact. It hasn't had an impact in the states that have had these rules. And then the question is going to be, well, there are these loopholes, and the loopholes are going to be like the ones I described. And I think it'd just be better if we just had that general discussion to begin with on those things.
Your questions.
Thank you. My name is Lauren Good. I'm from New Concord, Ohio, and I'm interested in the media coverage of gun crimes and gun possession that you mentioned. Earlier this year, Ohio passed a concealed carry law, House Bill 12, and in that bill, it granted people the right to carry a weapon with the proper permit and training. But in that discussion, there was a lot of deliberation about the right of the public to have access to the names of people who have concealed carry permits. Ultimately, the governor brokered a compromise that said the public won't have access to gun permit records, but journalists and the media could. So this summer, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published all the names of all the individuals who had requested a permit for carry concealed weapons in 14 counties around the Cleveland area in their paper. So I was curious, as we discussed tonight, the ability of the government to limit gun ownership, what your thoughts are on the balance of free speech, of the newspaper to print those names, and for a citizen as myself, perhaps, to find out who does have a gun permit, and the privacy concerns of gun owners.
So it's directed to both of us, or to?
Yeah, but particularly.
Okay. Well, I think there are two general issues that one could talk about with regard to concealed carry and the media. This one about the publishing of names, I'll just mention, and that is one of the benefits of having concealed carry is that the criminals don't know who's able to protect themselves until they actually go and attack the person. And so that produces benefits for people who would never even think of carrying a concealed handgun. You could have open carry. But what happens when you have open carry is that criminals can either wait till the person who has the open carry leaves the area, or that's the person that they try to deal with first. But most likely, they're the ones who benefit from carrying the gun. The other people who don't have a gun then don't receive any benefit. And I think my own belief is you'll see a bigger drop in crime with concealed carry overall than you see with open carry, though you privately get the benefit. So publicizing the names, I think, kind of robs you of the general benefit. I'll give you an analogy. I don't know if any of you know what LoJack is, that you put on cars, these little radio control devices that if your car gets stolen, the police turn it on, then they go and track it down. Well, in fact, in jurisdictions where they have LoJack, all the time, they have a restriction that says you can't advertise on your car that you have LoJack in there. And the reason why they do is because they believe that it generally deters people from stealing cars generally, and not just the car that was there. There's one other issue that I'd like to talk about with regard to concealed carry for just a second, and that is, I think it's interesting to see how this impacts the debate. Before this law got passed, there were lots of horror stories about things that would happen before the concealed handgun law gets passed. Very typical type of debate. Michigan, your nearby neighbor, that in 2001 passed the law, lots of horror stories. A year after the law gets passed, or maybe even 6 months after, you start seeing headlines in newspapers that say, what's happened? Have we had the type of carnage that people were predicting? And time after time, you see the exact same headlines saying, predicted carnage didn't happen. These people who have these permits tend to be extremely law-abiding. And it's interesting there because I think that has a real impact on the debate, because a lot of the people who have kind of pointed to or claimed that horror stories were going to happen and they don't happen, I think it affects their credibility and affects their ability to go and claim that the sky is going to be falling on other types of things that are going to be happening in the future. But anyway, those are my responses to it.
I think that's a very good question. Look, it's not just the privacy of gun owners, it's the privacy of everybody. I don't think the newspaper should be printing something like that. My feeling about concealed carry is I think the debate on it on both sides is kind of hysterical. I think on the left they say that it's going to cause carnage. I think on the right they talk about it as a panacea. I think they're both wrong. My general look at concealed carry is that it has it has no difference, makes no difference in the crime rate for a couple of reasons. One is that very few people actually decide to carry a concealed handgun, so people are choosing by, they're voting by with their permits. And second is people tend to get concealed carry permits in areas that have very low crime rates anyway, and that they tend not to be getting concealed carry permits in urban areas where there's high crime rate, and I think for a good reason. I mean, I just think it would be a mistake in my city, carrying a gun and being involved in a crime probably means you lose, because you're going to be going up against somebody who absolutely thinks their life is worthless. And in any type of negotiation like that, the person who's got more to gain is going to lose in that transaction. But what I would like to see in states that do CCW is what Utah did, which is they check every week or so against arrest records and conviction records, and they pull the CCW permits away from people who have been involved in crimes and shouldn't be, under law, shouldn't be allowed to have a permit, and frankly shouldn't be allowed to have a gun under the law. And they pull quite a few. So I think if you're going to allow a CCW permit, you should also have a system in place in which you're pulling permits for people who get convicted of crimes or at least are arrested. And you might want to see whether they should be carrying a CCW.
Can I just make a fast follow-up on that?
Over here.
Well, I wasn't really arguing with them. I just wanted to go and elaborate on something.
We'll get another shot. Go ahead.
I had a question for both of you. If gun crime dropped following the end of alcohol prohibition, is it reasonable to expect a reduction in gun crime in the 3% of counties mentioned if America similarly revised its drug policy?
Well, I think you would. I mean, I'm happy to go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
But there are trade-offs that you have in life. I think that if you go and legalize drugs, you'd have less violent crime in the sales, but you'd have a lower price for drugs, and people would be using more of them. And so, I think obviously there's this huge scourge that we have in urban areas where we have many poor people. They find this an attractive way to try to go and make money, and they get brought into this, and the death rate in these gangs is just unbelievable. I mean, I've seen numbers that indicate that the annual death rate for members of gangs can be any place from like 10 to 15%. I mean, it's just amazing the rate at which you have attrition in these things. It could be that you weight those types of problems where you're having all these deaths and people being brought into this much more than the cost might be from additional people using drugs that are going to be there. But, you mentioned prohibition. It's interesting. Relatively few people know that the highest murder rate that we ever had in the United States was in 1933, the last year of Prohibition. And with 2 years after Prohibition ended, the murder rate in the United States had fallen by about 60%, basically stayed low until you got to the mid-1960s. And, I mean, this isn't my argument, but Milton Friedman, for example, argues that the increases in those types of crimes corresponded with the war on drugs that we had here in the United States. And I also believe that if you look in the 90s, I mean, one credit you can give to Clinton, though it's usually not the way he would phrase it, at the end of the Bush administration, beginning of the Clinton administration, there was a big cutback in drug interdiction efforts. And what you had happening is prior to that, you had to be one of these big organized crime groups to bring in drugs in any massive amount in the country. As they cut back on the drug interdiction effort, you had more drugs coming in from more sources. And essentially, I would argue, that reduced in some sense the monopoly profits that the different drug distributors had. And as you reduce the profits, more than the drop in price per se, that reduced the incentives for gangs to go and fight against each other in order to try to control drug turf that was there. So I think one of the reasons why we had a drop in murder rates during the 90s was because of changes in drug enforcement effort that, beginning of the Clinton administration. One of the first things Clinton did, he cut the drug interdiction budget by about 70% that was there. And as I said, it was starting to be curtailed back at the end of Bush 1, too.
I agree with John on that, and I'll just briefly add one other point. Also, it's a question of what kind of society that you want to live in, and that just as you wouldn't do everything based on a pure economic model, or you wouldn't do everything in society based on what would reduce the crime rate. There are other factors that people are looking for in society. I mean, you'd reduce the crime rate. You might also just increase by a large amount the number of people who are inebriated on a daily basis who have serious drug problems. And I think you also see that with CCW. John would argue that with CCW you're going to reduce the crime rate. Well, let's say you do. But there's also people in society who feel like, look, maybe it does reduce the crime rate somewhat. I'm uncomfortable in a society in which I'm going to a restaurant and somebody might be carrying a gun. And that is also a viewpoint that needs to be respected as well. I mean, everybody has their own view about what they think makes it an optimal society.
Next question.
My question is to Mr. Kessler. Why are the liberal Democrats in the Senate and the House of Representatives continuing the assault on trying to disarm the citizens of the United States, such as your ex-boss, Mr. Schumer? We just can't understand why they continue to press the issue when the citizenry doesn't want it. Thank you.
Two things. One is when you say the citizenry doesn't want it, that is that isn't necessarily, the citizenry that you're talking about isn't necessarily a representative sample of America. There are plenty of citizens that, want it. Number two is, I worked for Schumer for 8 years. He is, probably the leader on the gun control issue in Congress, certainly was when he was in the House. But I've also seen, I also know how much his views are caricatured and how much he's caricatured, on his, where he stands on guns. And, his views on guns, they're to the left of mine, but they're not so much to the left of mine. He believes that law-abiding citizens should be able to buy a gun. Now, you're not going to hear that from the other side because that's not convenient. It's, we live in an environment where politicians are lampooned. That's the way it is. I mean, that's been the way it's been for 200 plus years. So I mean, and I think especially on this debate, that's what you see.
Yeah. I mean, I think people on both sides of this are well-meaning. We can go and argue whether they're mistaken, whether they're going to accomplish the opposite of what they'd like to do. But I guess to me, the debate on guns, as an economist, reminds me a lot of a debate on, let's say, price controls. I mean, economists look at this debate on price controls and figure, how can we keep on having this debate? I mean, we know price controls create shortages and create other problems that are there. It's not too surprising that most people may have a hard time understanding that. They see prices go up, let's say price of drugs or gasoline or something like that, and they see the direct solution is you just pass a law and stop the price from going up. Now, we know that when you do that, as an economist, it doesn't instantly produce a shortage. Gasoline companies keep inventories of gas in part because they think the price could go up in the future. You put the restriction on. They don't have any incentive to keep those inventories. They run them down, but it takes maybe 6 months or a year after the passage of the law before you start seeing a shortage. So it's harder for a lot of people to see the bad, unintended, long-term consequences of the law. They see the benefits up front. And I think in the case of gun control, what you see is I see a crime. I see a gun being committed with the crime. The obvious response is, well, if I just could take the gun away from that, that would solve the problem. But just like in the case of price controls where you have these kind of unintended consequences, I mean, economists would argue when you include the queuing time for waiting in for lines for gasoline that you have to go, it actually is a greater price. When you include the fact that you don't see these defensive gun uses that aren't going to be taking place, for example, the costs outweigh the benefits. It's much harder to observe the connection between the rules and these bad effects. And I think my own belief is that explains a lot of it there, just like it explains a lot of it why we continually see, whether it's drugs or other things, these debates about price controls coming up because a lot of economists just think about it and they just don't understand how this can keep on coming up.
Thank you. We're going to take one more question. I know there are others of you with questions, and I think our speakers will stay for a few minutes. You can come up directly and discuss with them. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is also for Mr. Kessler. I think clearly we're hearing from you sort of a more moderate take on gun control than we usually hear from a lot of gun control advocates. And so the focus of a lot of your remarks tonight was on the trafficking of guns between states and trying to solve that sort of black market issue. In your introduction, it was mentioned that you were involved in passing the assault weapons ban, and I'm wondering if you can explain how that has anything to do with the trafficking argument. And my understanding of that is that it bans, certain features on certain guns, and I'm curious what that has to do with that argument.
That's a very good question. If I could make a trade and say, I'll take the gun show, closing the gun show loophole, but I have to give up the assault weapons ban, I would take that trade in a second. I mean, one law, I think, has a real impact on, shutting down this black market. The other law, I think, is 90%, 80 to 90% symbolic. I don't think it is a totally symbolic law. There is a difference between these firearms and the types of firearms that typical gun owners buy. They are, their design is such that they are more lethal. The police are adamantly in support of the assault weapons ban, and while I view it as mostly marginal and symbolic, police don't. And at a certain point, you just got to trust the people in blue who are telling you, no, this is really, really important. But I really do believe that the gun show loophole, closing that, is 50 times more important than renewing the assault weapons ban.
Well, I mean, again, it would be nice if either of these two laws made a difference. I don't know of any academic work that shows the assault weapons ban reduced violent crime, and I think it's largely for the type of reason that Jim's saying, that we ban guns on the basis of their looks or certain type of cosmetic features. These guns are functionally identical to other guns that weren't banned. And again, I have nothing per se against background checks. I just don't see any evidence that the Brady Act had an impact. I don't see any evidence that the gun show regulations have an impact. And my belief is that, at least in the gun shows, it's more likely to disadvantage, as I said earlier, so I'm not going to go into this too much, law-abiding citizens relative to criminals. And that, the costs outweigh the benefits.
Okay. I want to thank, first of all of you for coming out tonight and for being both a good audience and great participants here in this after discussion. I want to thank our advocates. I want to thank the Root Foundation for its sponsorship, for the other sponsors and funders, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for all of its work, the John Glenn Institute, the OSU Speech and Debate Team, and our timekeeper, Joel Thomas. Why don't you express thanks for all those people? For those of you who did not get your questions answered, our speakers will remain. Please come up and talk with them, talk with one another. This has been a great dialogue. Thanks again.